Hello, you're listening to Lists and Other Things That No One Asked For with Jesse Barbin, your weekly mini podcast where stuff usually takes the form of a list about pop culture, music, growing up. So I hope you like it. There's nothing better than a good science fiction movie. When you're growing up in the suburbs, it's very boring, and that's probably why they appealed so strongly to me. You can get into Star Wars, but that will only get you so far. When I was a child, Star Wars was very finite and consisted of only 3 movies and a bunch of loosely connected extended universe novels. That's wild to consider now, because in the modern era, you can't swing a dead cat without hitting some increasingly controversial new Star Wars content. I would watch Star Wars every single Saturday morning. I would get up around 6 a.m. on a Saturday because that was the only time my house was quiet, and I would watch a Star Wars movie and just rotate through the first 3 every few Saturdays. It left me hungry for more science fiction. Watching a big science fiction movie in a movie theater felt like the most fun thing a human person could do. My parents never took us to even one movie in the movie theater, and I get it, that's fine. It was expensive to take a bunch of kids to a movie. I'm just explaining the context and part of why movies were such a big deal to me. The first movie I remember seeing in the theaters was Dennis the Menace. We were staying with my aunt, and she took us to the dollar movie to see it, and we thought it was the coolest thing. I had another cool aunt who took me to Star Trek Generations. My conservative parents wouldn't let me watch Star Trek at home because it was quote-unquote too sexual, so I had no idea what was going on in that movie, but I knew enough to know that it ruled. Cut to several years later, and I'm in middle school asking my dad for $7 or $10 or whatever. I don't remember how much movies cost back then, what the right price was, but I do remember my dad would eventually break down and give me the money. But first, I would have to listen to a long unwinding of all the hardships of his life and his trials and tribulations, as well as how money doesn't grow on trees, and so on and so forth, until I questioned if I really wanted to see a movie after all. If I had been old enough to give plasma or work on a chain gang or do literally anything else other than ask my dad for money, I would have gladly done it. I feel like I grew up in the golden age of cool science fiction movies, a lot of them starring Will Smith. I saw Men in Black and Independence Day in the theater. Those movies are so awesome it was worth every minute of lecturing from my dad. I was a small white kid from the suburbs of New Mexico, but watching Will Smith quip and punch his way through multiple movies made me want to be Will Smith, which I know was not likely, but that was still my goal around age 12. This is not the point I set out to make, but I do want to note while I'm here, you can plug Will Smith into pretty much any movie and he will improve it. He can't necessarily save it, but he will improve it. He carried Men in Black 2 and 3. Case in point, Men in Black International did not have Will Smith, and it suffered, no matter how jacked Chris Hemsworth is. Even the Will Smith movies that are less popular, such as I, Robot and Hancock, those are still pretty good. The beautiful part about seeing movies when you're 12, 13, or 14 is you don't know that they're bad movies. I went and saw the 4th Batman movie, Batman and Robin, and I know that's not strictly science fiction, but we would see pretty much any movie we could. I saw Batman and Robin with my buddy Daniel, and that's widely considered to be the movie that killed Batman for like a decade. And me and my buddy Daniel saw it at the Cottonwood Mall in Albuquerque. It let out too late, and his dad didn't want to come pick us up, so we had to walk home through the night for quite a long way. But all the way home, we talked obliviously about how cool that Batman movie was. Me and my buddy Daniel saw all the cool movies. We saw Gattaca, and we were freaking out like, he broke his own legs, bro. And then we saw Stargate, The Fifth Element, Star Trek First Contact, The X-Files, Jurassic Park, Armageddon, so forth and so on. Apollo 13, that's not science fiction, but it is space. We digested them all pretty well, but then we got to Contact, it stumped us, or at least it stumped me. There's not a lot of action, some explosions, but not much. There's no quips. There are technically aliens, but you don't really see them. It was more cerebral and heavy sci-fi, and that was my first taste of it, and I was unsure if I liked it or not. When they announced that they were making more Star Wars movies and that they would be prequels, I was stoked. It is hard to overstate the amount of stokedness I felt. The idea of George Lucas making prequels had been floating around since the 80s, and I just assumed that they would be amazing. They came out when I was a little older, and I remember changing out of my oil-stained Jiffy Lube uniform and running through a rare New Mexico rain shower to catch a ride with Daniel to go to the Cottonwood Mall again, this time to watch The Phantom Menace, the first Star Wars movie in years. We were older and could think a little more critically than we were when we saw Batman, and I think we ended up thinking it was just okay. I didn't hate it, but it didn't make me feel the way Empire Strikes Back did, but it was a decent popcorn movie. This is also not the point I set out to make, but it's weird to know that I've lived long enough to see one Star Wars trilogy come out, be reviled, and then ultimately be redeemed and be kind of beloved in its own weird way. I imagine the more recent sequel trilogy will eventually get its own redemption arc, but I can't say for sure. It feels like the world is a lot angrier now, so it's impossible to say. The only movie I saw this summer was Twisters, which is not strictly a science fiction movie, but it was a lot of fun, and it made me feel a little bit like a kid again, like I was describing earlier. Only this time I didn't have to beg my dad for any cash. Thanks for listening. I appreciate it. If you prefer reading, there's a Substack. You can talk to me on any social medias at Jesse Barbin. Have a good week.